Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the first Radical Independence Dundee meeting that we've had for about 4 months now. Unfortunately, we weren't very well expecting how long this lockdown would last. When we last met, it was in March in Lochee, and we were discussing the impact of austerity in working class communities. We were joined by activists from Lochee Community Larder who are directly involved in supplying food to hundreds of the most vulnerable people in our city. I'm really pleased that today we'll be joined by George Kerevan. George Kerevan is a former SNP MP. He's an economist, he's a journalist, and he recently wrote an excellent article for Connor, which was titled SNP at the Crossroads. I've circulated the article. I'm not sure how many of you have read it. I'm hoping that we have a good discussion, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite George to give a little bit of the background and explain his thoughts behind writing it, and then we'll have a broader discussion where everyone has the opportunity to share their thoughts. And then I think we'll have a bit of a discussion at the end about what we want to do next as Radical Independence Dundee. And I'm sure that there's plenty of people here not necessarily from Dundee, but please feel free to stick around, share your thoughts. We're very keen to hear from radical independence activists all over the country. But with that in mind, George, on you go.
Thanks, Connor, and thanks everybody for inviting me to chat to you. I've got myself in a little bit of hot water with this piece. A couple of months ago, I wrote a piece about Angus Brendan McNeill, and I called him the bad boy of the SNP. And Angus immediately got a T-shirt made which says "Bad Boy of the SNP," which he sent me a picture of. So he's now threatening to send me a version of my own. Clearly, we are in an extraordinary position with independence up at 54% in the polls. And if you look at the don't knows, they're at quite a high level, 7%, which is you know, for don't knows, that's quite a lot. And it suggests that, I mean, I don't think those are people moving from yes to no. I think that the don't knows are largely people moving from no to maybe, and who could be won over. So we are probably looking at something like 58% if we actually had a referendum sometime soon. And I know over the last period, the internal party polling has suggested we might get as high as 60 come a referendum. I actually don't think, for those very reasons, we're going to get a referendum anytime soon, or certainly not a legal one. There's a very good article in the Spectator this week. You probably don't read the Spectator, but on the basis of reading what your enemy's thinking, it's worth having a look at. And the editorial this week in the Spectator is about the Union and the independence question in Scotland. And there's actually a quote from somebody, I'll read it to you. It says, the person who wrote this, James Forsyth, says, "When I asked one of the most impressive figures from the 2014 referendum how things were going, the answer came simply, 'It's over, the horse has bolted.'" Now, I think that's Alistair Darling. So quite clearly the Unionist camp is spooked. Which means that there's obviously a lot of pressure on us not to rock any boats, and I understand that. So a lot of people have got a bit annoyed by what I've written. And the intention wasn't to rock any boats, but I am not a believer in stages in politics. And I think once you start believing in stages in politics, you get yourself into a lot of real trouble. Stages, but I mean, first we'll get independence, then we can get socialism. In fact, ends and means are bound up dialectically. And the record of history is that if you put off socialism and try and get this and that before, then you end up losing socialism, losing the left agenda. You have to do both together. Now, I wrote this little piece because I was trying to clear in my own brain. Usually I write to get clear what's going on. It's a kind of laboratory. And I was increasingly worried by how rightwards has been our economic SNPs, it's been governments, policy trajectory. And of course, there's some good things, and there's a lot of good words spoken. But the practice is getting pretty dangerous. And I gave some examples in the article. It was triggered by, of course, appointing Benny Higgins to chair and run the Economic Recovery Group. Higgins, ex-banker, resigned in disgrace from Tesco Bank. Now the chair of Buccleuch Estates, our largest feudal landlord. The Duke of Buccleuch's horrible history. The granddaddy of the present one was an acolyte of Hitler, and I mean that in the broadest sense, that Hitler invited him and he went to Hitler's birthday in April 1939. A really nasty bunch, and of course the Buccleuch Estates at the moment having a series of wars with local communities across Scotland. Now, why would, if the Tories had appointed somebody like Benny Higgins to produce a recovery document, we'd all been up in arms. I mean, every SNP MP would have been standing up in Parliament denouncing this. So how they got to the situation where Benny Higgins is putting his oar in has become a chief advisor to the FM. Now, I don't think it's wrong to ask that question, and it's not aimed at anyone in particular. And I was trying all the way through the article not to personalize this. I'm trying to understand processes and forces at work that may be shifting the SNP to the right, and what we can do about that if that is the case. And the article then goes on to try and do some sketches of where policy has gone right wing. And if you use those as a template and follow into stuff I've written at length in Bella, where I've gone into the details of all of this. So SEPA, our main regulatory body for the environment, is stuffed full of big oil and the big banks, and has been using that weight to stop investigations going on. Our major export strategy is based on exporting food and drink, and the key sector there is factory farming of salmon, which is destroying the environment, destroying both factory farm fish and wild fish, and that the bulk of the salmon farming is owned by a giant Norwegian multinational, which is privately owned by one of the nastiest people in Norway, who's been under investigation for tax fraud. Now, why are we devoting all the effort to trying to promote this foreign multinational, which is having fights all around the world, actually? There's big fights go on between Maui and people in Chile. Here in Edinburgh, where I am, the major city centre property development has been funded both by an SNP council and directed by Scottish Government, is run by the company. We've been investing, giving taxpayers money, and it's gone to a company which is the biggest foreign American landowner in Brazil and is burning down Brazilian savannah as we speak. So how could we have an ethical foreign policy, an ethical green policy, where we're actually funding the companies burning down the Amazon? Now, these things are known, but they're not forming part of the debate in the party and the wider national movement. And I think that once you make bed with these kind of people, then we are looking at a possibility of an independent Scotland, which will not go in the socialist direction that we all want. So I then went on to say, well, what's causing this kind of shift to the right? It's made me think about where the SNP as a party is. I've been in the party for 25 years. The party, for all of its long history, down to the 1990s, was very much a movement, and trying to be a mass movement, start a small movement, and become a mass movement. A movement of the left, started out very petty bourgeois, but it's increasingly in the last 30, 35 years become clearly a social democratic movement. And a movement that was democratic, I mean, with all its flaws, and which tried to remain a movement that applied pressure from below. Now, that has changed quite dramatically in my lifetime, once we got devolution. Now, perfectly, I mean, I wanted devolution, I fought for it, probably a lot of you fought for it. Right, but what has happened in the last 20 years, and particularly since 2007, when the SNP came into government, is that the SNP has shifted towards, particularly within it, the political structures, less of a movement and more of a parliamentarist organisation run from the top down, less and less democratic, and the movement has become more and more an appendage of what goes on at Holyrood and to an extent at Westminster, than it is a movement of the people and in the streets. And the result is that the party leadership, which tries to straddle, I think this is dangerous, it's proven to be quite a dangerous situation, a party leadership which straddles both the organisation of the movement and an organisation at a parliamentary level has become confused between the two. And because it's become increasingly parliamentarist, the movement has become subordinated to what goes on at Parliament. And I've mentioned the biggest example of this, no particular brains required, is that the FM closed down the campaign, the mass campaign, the doorstep campaign for independence just after the battering we took at the 2017 general election. The campaign that had been cranked up after the Brexit referendum, the conversation with Scotland, all the knocking on the doors, the million signatures, that was all aborted in midstream. The million signatures had never been counted, if there were a million, or what they said. All that activity, 8 months activity, was just closed down. That was it, and there's been no leadership from the party at a street level or in a campaign mode since then. Now, of course, things are happening at a parliamentary level, and I'm not discounting that. And yes, you can say that, yes, we're at 54% in the polls for independence and rising. So the parliamentary route works. Yeah, we'll see. I'll get down to that. But the movement was put into cold storage. The result was that it was the autonomous movement, like All Under One Banner, like the Independence Foundation, that puts money into campaigning, and the recreation of the yes groups. And certainly in my area, lots of people have bailed out of party activity and gone into recreating the yes groups. So we have had a surge of activity from below, but it's not been led by the SNP. And that division between moving from below and the leadership at a parliamentary level, I think that division is worrying, because it says when it comes to tactical decision making, the movement has been crowded out. And if we end up in a situation where Boris doesn't grant a Section 30, we could be in this endless loop of let's have another election, let's demand another mandate, and let's just be nice bourgeois Democrats, and eventually Boris will knuckle under. Well, Boris can't knuckle under. Boris can't give a Section 30 because a Section 30 in the current conditions leads immediately to independence. And that's the end of Boris's career. You're not a Tory, a populist Tory like Boris, with the kind of English populism that he's cranked up. You don't lose part of the union and stay at number 10. So it's quite clear that what they're going to do is they're going to go on saying, well, you had a referendum, it was for a generation, you have to wait a generation to the next one. Now, of course, if we have 1, 2 more elections and we're running at 55, 58% in the polls for independence, of course that creates huge crises for Tory rule. And I don't know what the outcome of that, but what I'm saying is that anybody who thinks there's an automatic route to a second referendum in the current conditions is barking up the wrong tree. Now, I think that we will be faced, as with every national movement that's got independence from the British state, we have to apply pressure from below, pressure on the streets, as well as parliamentary pressure. The two go together. Not discounting what Nicola's done at all, brilliant what she's done so far, but I'm saying we have no plan B. So the rest of the article is really trying to explain why perhaps the SNP leadership, it's a very narrow leadership in my experience, half a dozen people, why the SNP leadership has in fact subordinated everything to its own electoral calculations. And I made some points, and there's things that we all discuss, but maybe we don't discuss them in public as so much. The entire leadership is, of course, concentrated in the FN's hands and that of her husband, who's been the chief executive for 20 years. And I don't think that is correct. I don't think that is democratic. and the functioning of the party, its conferences and so on, have ceased to be where policy is made. Now, you and I know that the frustration that all of this has created is leading to parts of the movement discussing other kinds of options, including the whole debate about running another party on the list system. I was making no statements on that, and I haven't taken a position on that. I was trying to look at forces that were flowing through the movement and trying to explain some of the frustration of the movement. But you and I know that there's a mega divisions emerging between the current leadership and Alex Salmond. I did not want to go into the personal issues there. Salmond was found innocent at his trial, but equally at the trial he admitted to a lot of sexual misconduct. And we can draw our own conclusions about whether Alex should therefore continue in any form of frontline political politics. But it's not the personalities that are involved or the personal conduct of individuals that I'm interested in. It's the forces that are at work. And there clearly are tensions, dramatic tensions, in the SNP leadership as presently constituted and with its present tack and the mass movement. And that unless we resolve those tensions, irrespective of personalities, then the movement will run into trouble. And there's no point in saying, because of these material forces at work, no point in saying don't rock any boats, don't publish articles, because that doesn't make the crisis go away, the tensions within the movement go away. Now, just to finish, I mean, my own personal view is that some of this might be resolved if we follow the Catalan line and the mass movement was separated in the sense that it can be separated totally and organically from the SNP. But I think the organisation of the day-to-day work of the mass movement, as it is in Catalonia, should be entrusted to a convention, an assembly, which everyone can take part in, including non-SNP members, which elects a separate leadership from the political parties. And so we get a division between the movement in the streets and the Scottish government. And so we reduce some of the tensions that way. That doesn't remove the issue of the debate over what the tactics should be. And you'll gather, I think we do need some kind of plan B beyond simply hoping that Boris will give us a Section 30. And rather, I mean, yes, by all means, because of the time frame, we need to have the Holyrood elections. Let's win those elections. And if we get a majority, an outright majority there, it does put lots of pressure on the Westminster government to grant Section 30. In the event that they don't, and I don't think they will, then we have to turn somewhere else. So we have to apply pressure from below, which is what's always happened when dealing with the British state. And I'm just worried, and this is my final point here, is that the separation of movement and government and leadership, SNP leadership, and the tensions that have been created have, and the pushing away of any debate about a plan B is dangerous in itself, demobilizes the movement, creates demoralization, and we have to confront these things. So, you know, don't rock any boats, I understand, and we shouldn't, I mean, no one wants to deliberately try and create a focus of debate within the movement that takes away from the politics of the campaign for independence and the fight against the Tory government. But we should need to be grown up, and I think the movement is grown up enough to discuss tactics and discuss some of the problems it faces. And that was really all that my article was trying to do.
That's great. Thank you very much, George, for that introduction. I think that was really useful. Listen, I'm not normally the chair at our meetings. I'm normally just the secretary. I think with this being our first Zoom meeting, I will probably play the role of chair, assuming that's okay with everyone. If folks, there's two options here. You should have a button for actually raising your hand on the screen. If you just want to raise your hand, I'll call on you, unmute yourself and put your question, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. Is anyone keen to go first? Alan, on you go.
Hi, George. Just to your point on Benny Higgins, I don't know if you saw the Channel 4 news last night about the community down in Dumfries by the state from the Duke of Buccleuch. You know, they're going to do they're trying to get £5 million together to do a buyout. So Benny Higgins was on the TV, and you know the reporter said to him, why doesn't the Duke of Buccleuch just give this away? And that Benny Higgins said, well, it's a business. You know, if they don't give us it, we'll sell it to somebody else. And you know, to see him, you know, it goes back to this almost unacceptable face of capitalism. It was really making my blood boil. And having read your article, you know, and you mention him again, and this is the kind of faces. This is what we're up against. You know, if we're not organising something properly, you know, this kind of demoralisation, it just, you know, it's almost politics as usual, and it lets people like him and the Duke of Buccleuch and you know, Angus Grossart and the rest of the sort of Scottish financial mafia come in and you know, kind of take over the independence movement. And do you think that with all the parliamentarians, with them, you know, with all the lobbyists and that are in Holyrood and in Westminster and that, do you think that not having a movement from below, do you not think not having that participation really, do you think that's why the heads have been turned? Do you think that because, you know, they're getting winded down by all these special interests and that's the reason that they've taken over, and they're not hearing from anybody? You know, I think of Pete Wishart, you know, he's always putting on Twitter, well, I've been to this play, I've been to this restaurant, I've done this, and you know, I want to be the speaker and everything. You always think, Jesus, he's fundamentally what is wrong with, dare I say, the professional politician of the SNP, who are obviously, you know, a lot of incomes are now dependent upon the Westminster gravy train. You know, and you know, let's not kid ourselves. If Pete Wishart could get away with it, he'd go into the House of Lords. You know, he'd have the ermine robes on and that. So my question is, do you think that there is some people who within the SNP who maybe don't want independence because their incomes depend on it, and you know, they're now a part of the ruling class, and you know, as I say, if you're earning a good wage out of something, then you know, you're not going to want to give that up.
I mean, Connor, do you want to do one by one, or do you want to take a couple of questions, three questions?
Is anyone else have a question you'd like to add in? Maybe if you just deal with that one.
Okay, I'll deal with Alan's point. Right, I'm honestly trying not to personalise this. Now, it's not because I do not have personal views. It's not because I don't know a lot of the people involved and could really make your blood curdle. But I think if I personalise it, then it looks like, you know, I've already been told, you know, I'm just grumpy because I'm not on the gravy train. I'm trying to look at social forces, because I think truly it is social forces that are at work. So I'll just quickly look at the Buccleuch estates, because I've actually read through all of their filings with the Corporations House. So I've gone through all the company papers, and the Buccleuch estates appointed Higgins to carry through a particular strategy. It's the second biggest landowner. It's always been the biggest feudal landowner. But they have decided that agricultural holdings do not earn enough profit. And certainly they won't do post-Brexit when, you know, you get a flood tide of cheap American food coming in. So agriculture is on a serious backpedal. So the Buccleuch estates have decided to dump a lot of their extraneous land that they don't need. The current strategies where they think they can now make their profits is in building houses, so turning a lot of their land, greenbelt land, into construction housing, and in big energy. So they're moving up the supply chain. So they're dumping a lot of the land they can't use, which is why they are offering land to community buyers. It's not because they're nice people, Democrats, right? It's just like they want rid of this stuff. But they want rid of it for a price. And the Langham estate is quite an interesting one, because the Langham estate, one of the earlier dukes stole in the early 1900s. And everyone knows this, and there were court cases then, there have been court cases ever since. So here's land that was clearly, utterly stolen, not land just given by the king, you know, but land that these men out and stole, and are now claiming they own. And part of the legality of the thing is the locals are debating whether, in fact, the state owns this land. And they want their money. And you know, one of the weaknesses in our current the Scottish Government's current land reform legislation is there's too little money to give to local communities to buy out. Now, I mean, personally, I'd just tax the buggers and take it off them. But there's no way that the Langham people can actually raise the 6 million. But actually, I mean, it's such a tiny amount of money, really. One would hope the Scottish Government could give it to them. What will happen is that eventually, if there isn't a community buyout, the Clue Estates will just sell this land off to some volume house builder, or they'll do a deal with them, and they build houses. So they just let, the builders with wall-to-wall houses is around me. So there's a real game going. So the question is, why is it, Alan? I'll ask, what's pushing this? Is it just individuals on the take within the Scottish Government? Of course not. More complicated than that. Scottish Government, I think, clearly wants to create a broad united front to get maximum pressure for independence. So what it wants to do is to bring in the middle class and the business community to support independence, or its version of independence. And so therefore it has been very, very open to doing deals with the private sector, which I think is socialists, we're all socialists here, scandalise us. But it's if you have a popular front mentality and you think we should bring in get the business class in support of independence, as well as the working people who voted yes in Dundee and in Glasgow in 2014. If you do that, you start making concessions. And I know that we make these concessions. I mean, I know people involved amongst our SPADs who make these concessions. And it's done with a strategy in mind. We'll bring the business connect system, we bring business community in on our side. The trouble is, now here's the real problem. The Clue Estates is one of the odd people out because it's Scottish. In the last 20 years, the Scottish economy has largely been sucked into a global supply chain network. 50 years ago, most of the Scottish economy was Scottish owned. Even 20, 30 years ago, most of the Scottish economy was largely Scottish owned, particularly the banking community. In the last 20, 25 years, the bulk of the Scottish economy has been taken over by foreign control, control from London in the part, but also foreign control like salmon fishing. So if you're trying to do a deal that says, let's create a broad front to support independence, including the business community, unfortunately, you start ending up doing a deal with foreign capital. And I think that is the Faustian bargain. That's supping with the devil. That's where it's got very, very dangerous. And that's why I think we're making these kind of dangerous bargains that's pushing us to the point where if we get independence, we'll find we're sitting down with foreign investors, people who own the Scottish economy, and then they're not going to want socialism. And we'll end up with the Scottish Government working for a business community that is foreign owned. The final point on Alan's question. On the PR people, on the actual people who do a lot of the negotiating and working for business. Rather dangerously, the party has allowed a lot of ex-SPADs and ex-special advisors on leaving government and party office to get jobs with big companies. And I know that this was seen as a bridge to capital and winning over the business community. So Aberdeen Asset Management, some of the very big London PR companies have people in them, ex-SNP staffers, at a very high level indeed. And that was seen as a bridge. And I have to confess, hands up here, I mean, these people would usually, when I was an MP, they'd invite me to go and speak to the company boards and stuff, and I'd go and do that. And the penny began to drop with me. But it's a dangerous bridge, relying on ex-SNP staffers to work inside big companies to put the SNP case across. Doesn't it work like that? They end up doing the other way. They end up being able to phone up SNP ministers and say, hello, it's your ex-staffer here, but would you like to have lunch with so-and-so Joe Bloggs of this big bank, American bank, because they'd like to chat and meet you. Then you start to open up a backdoor influence into Scottish government which I think is dangerous. Now, it's not about personalities being on the take or being corrupt or anything. That's about creating systems which rebound against you. And I think that is where we're at the moment.
Thanks, George. Just to say as well, if anyone wants to use the chat to put in a question instead of speaking out loud, you're more than welcome to do that. I was actually going to make a little observation when you're talking about the power of wealth, George. Obviously today the Russia report came out, the one that was anticipated for months and months and months. And it seems to have driven all kinds of odd discourse about Russian meddling in elections and in referendums in 2014 and 2016. But one thing I thought was actually really interesting from the report, from a left perspective, was talking about the level of influence that wealth can buy you in Britain, because it basically talked about oligarchs who'd extracted obscene amounts of wealth from the Soviet Union coming to Britain after 1991 and basically been fully integrated into the business and social scene, particularly in London, just on the basis of their wealth. And it basically saw this as, you can't do anything about this. We want their wealth, but unfortunately, we don't want to take the political ramifications of it. And I think that's interesting in the context of talking about the SNP making a connection with capital, and certainly globalized capital, and what kind of political implications that might have for Scotland and the decisions we might want to make. Does anyone else have a specific question to put? Okay, well, I've got one, George. I actually saw that in the National recently. I'm not sure if this was a quote from your speech to the All Under One Banner demonstration, but there was a comparison you made from what we have to do to the anti-poll tax struggle. And I thought that was kind of a useful comparison. And I was curious how you think a similar strategy from the poll tax struggle, which was successful, could be applied to the independence movement.
Yeah, I think that we have to leave on the table the prospect of mass civil disobedience. Now, I've said this lots of times, and I don't say it lightly. I think it's a last resort. I think we're not talking about kamikaze actions by, half a dozen people here and there. If you were going to do mass civil disobedience, as with the first great CND wave in the 60s, from which the SNP was born, modern SNP, or the resistance to cruise missiles in the 80s, which many people took part in. Mass civil disobedience is a way of showing, that the nation's not going to take no for an answer when it comes to independence or a second referendum. And that was, of course, the essence of the poll tax campaign, which was highly successful. Now, I've raised this within the party. I mean, I remember I had one occasion speaking to the serried ranks of the SNP pensioners, and they all cheered. So they'll be the first to chain themselves to the gates. But I stress, mass civil disobedience has to be well thought through, which is why I, again, come back to the question. I think the mass movement has to have some kind of structure, some kind of elected structure and leadership. We can discuss these matters. If we're going to have some mass civil disobedience, if we're forced into it, underlying if we're forced into it, we have to train for it. We have to discuss it. We have to make sure that people know what they're going to. So this is not, I'm not, trying to be silly or populist or a bit mad, but I'm just saying, but we shouldn't rule that out. And I think that ultimately, if we find ourselves in a situation where we've got the Boris Johnson government, which is unique, this is a populist government, it's a poor government that, anybody within the Tories gets, gets the message wrong, gets expelled. I mean, like Lewis, who was just elected the head of the Security Committee. I mean, this is quite a Stalinist government we've got, organised by Mr. Cummings. So I don't think they're going to give us anything for nothing, essentially. So we may have to look at something like, of the ilk of the poll tax. All I would say is that's not something for next week or the next few months. It's something that if we eventually, after a long, heart-searching discussion in the movement, we decide to do, then we should do it. We should leave that on the table. I think ultimately it may come to that.
Thanks, George. I'm going to call on Marty first, and then Stuart, and then I've got a question in the chat from Emily. So on you go, Marty.
Hi there, George. Just a question in regards to, I know you said you didn't want to take a personal position on it, but I feel like I'm quite surprised at how much oxygen the sort of SNP hierarchy are really giving the list parties that have come around. As someone who was involved with RISE in 2016, I felt like they just kind of ignored us. And anything that happened out with the movement since then has kind of just been ignored. For example, with things like the First Minister not coming to the All Under One banner rallies and things like that. And I've seen articles from Alan Smith, some other MPs in the National about why it has to be both votes SNP. And I don't think that campaign was so pushed last time. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on why are they giving it so much attention this time?
Do you want to come right George, or do you want me to invite Stuart?
I'll do the two of them then.
Stuart.
Thanks, George. Thanks for your introduction. George, what about Dundee? What about the fact that many Dundonians are in dispute with the local authority, which is SNP led, that given COVID, it's perhaps unsurprising that our community centres and libraries aren't open, but there's concern about when they will open and if they will open. What part of the alliance could the defence of local government make in shifting the balance of forces that you're talking about?
Okay, I'll do it. I'll answer the two questions the other way around, because one leads into the other, I think. It is quite clear right across Scotland, maybe not quite so much in Glasgow, there are elements, but certainly in Edinburgh, certainly in Dundee and other places. Local community campaigning is going on a lot of fronts directed against SNP councils. And that, you know, there might be various explanations for that, but there's clearly a lot of frustration at a local level. And partly, I think, because of budget cuts, which you can't ignore. It's partly because some SNP councils have played this game I was talking about earlier at a local level, particularly in Edinburgh. They've got into bed with the developers on a grand scale, hoping they could get money put into local activities, schools and so on to offset budget cuts. But it's gone far too far. Edinburgh is effectively in the hands of big property developers now. Now, if you look at Europe, much of the anti-austerity successes in Europe have actually been at a city level, city-wide campaigns drawing right across the left political spectrum. Have been very successful. But just a couple of weeks ago in France, the local elections, their second round, big gains for the left at a local level. I personally think we need to look at that, and here's Kerevan really sticking his head above the parapet. In 2022, where we have the local elections, assuming they go ahead, I think the left should be looking at creating local alliances to run local lists, citizens lists. I don't think that undercuts the SNP. I don't think that undercuts the movement for independence. You don't have to have, SNP doesn't have to run every council in Scotland. I think that there is a big opening for the left to re-energise itself, the left right across the spectrum, and link up with a lot of these local campaign groups, which are grassroots community groups. And I think a Citizens for Glasgow, or Citizens for Dundee, Citizens for Edinburgh could get a lot of traction as a PR, because it's a proportional representation election. We could win seats, and I think that's and the SNP the SNP had campaigned for years to devolve more powers and tax-raising powers to local government. It hasn't done it. It's reneged. The SNP current leadership has reneged on a long-time party position for pushing tax-raising powers away from central government to local authorities. I think that still, to me, is where we should go. So I do think that there's a whole area of struggle where we shouldn't, we shouldn't run, kick our heels, wait for independence. Let's get going on that now. Which brings us back to the more strategic question of the two votes. Now, I think there is a case at a strategic level, if it could be achieved, for CU1 could mop up the votes, the SNP votes on the list, which will go nowhere, in order to create a supermajority at Holyrood to back, the strength of the mandate for independence. There are two problems, and I think we should look at these problems very carefully. Problem number one, a lot of people are playing silly buggers, and so we're not going to have one party on the list. We're likely to have 2, 3, many. We're likely to spend the next 6-8 months, in a stupid internal discussion about who gets to, which party is the right one, who gets to stand, and all that kind of crap. And there'll be a lot of egos involved. So it has every chance of going off half-cocked, right? And it will divert the movement. So unless we can find a way of sorting that out, and the only way of sorting it out comes back to my original proposition, the movement needs a clear elected leadership in the form of some national convention, national assembly, like the Catalans have. And then we can discuss it at that level. And you're either in or you're out, because the movement will decide, and not individuals. Right, here's the second problem with this strategy. Let's suppose we win a supermajority. I know exactly what Boris is going to say. Boris and Cummings will say, that's anti-democratic, because you have gamed the electoral system, you have destroyed it, it means that Tories haven't got any seats. So you're evil, you're anti-democratic, so we're going to ignore you. So actually, even if we were successful, it could backfire. Now, personally, I think bugger Boris Johnson. But and if you get a supermajority, you get a supermajority. But I'm just pointing out that it probably will not have the impact, if you're successful, that you think it will. Might have some international repercussions, which would be good. But I think whatever, I think even winning a supermajority, Boris will say no. He'll use that, he turns everything the other way around. He'll use that as an excuse to say no to Section 30. We're back to the proposition, how do we get action on the streets if we're going to get our way?
Okay, I've got 3 written questions and a hand up. What I'll do is I'm going to put 2 of the written questions to you first, because I think they go hand in hand. Emily Robinson asks, the organised independence movement is far smaller than the sum total of pro-independence people in Scotland, and by and large, those people don't represent as socially reactionary a group as large swathes of the independence movement. How can we avoid being taken hostage by, for example, anti-trans or anti-migrant socially conservative parts of the movement, while still putting pressure on the SNP leadership, which has made more overtures to social liberalism? And the second question is, please can you give me more detail about the political tensions in the SNP leadership? Is it simply a left-right issue, or is it more complex than that?
I'm just fending my cat off here.
I'll bring your cat in the meeting.
You'll tell, you can see he's an anarchist. He's a black anarchist. You can tell there's a red one around who's the bullshit. Right. No. I suppose the answer to Emily's first question is that if we create a democratic assembly, well, that's all we can do. I mean, you can only work through democracy. And my critique of the SNP leadership is they don't have democracy in the movement. The movement's ignored. If you have a democratic forum, we can discuss, we can argue the various issues being taken up by the movement. If we can't have the discussion, then we can't resolve it. I think that the SNP leadership is very socially liberal. I don't deny that. I sometimes think it is a cover to pretend that they're not making huge concessions to big business. And I think both are important, because if we ended up with an independent Scotland run by big business, then we'd end up with exactly what has been happening in the Scandinavian countries, and where, to my sorrow, because social democratic governments in Scandinavian countries and Nordic countries have drifted well to the right, they have opened the door, because once you open the door, once you move to the right wants the real, fascism. And what you'll see across the Nordic countries is that genuine fascist parties, no hyperbole, people who shoot you, people who will smash the trade unions, people who want to smash trans rights genuinely, have developed. 15% of the population, 15% of voters in most Nordic countries are fascist. Plus huge right-wing free market neoliberal parties emerge. My horror would be an independent Scotland, having made concessions to the right, ends up exactly with the kind of political demographic profile that we've got in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. And that would put us back so far. And yes, I quite agree with them that there are trends. There are right-wing trends within Scotland. I don't deny that. I've seen some of the things, seen some of the events in Freedom Square in Glasgow. But the way we deal with it, you can agree with me or not, but I think the way we deal with it is we have to democratise the independence movement, because that's all we have got. And if the, I don't want to put words in Emily's mouth, but if she's suggesting, and some people have suggested, hinted this, we can rely on Nicola, and let's just, sit back and let Nicola do it, because she's such a wonderful person. Now, I've known Nicola 25 years. I have the greatest respect for her. And frankly, she works a 24-hour day. You try running a government. It's not, the fact that she's still on her feet is amazing. And the fact that she's so articulate and so empathetic, which is why I think she's won over so many people during the lockdown. But let me be clear, I am a socialist. The politics of personality, the politics of leadership cults, no matter who the leader is, are dangerous, apolitical, non-socialist, and must be avoided. We are a democratic movement, and it is through the self-activity of the working class and the democracy of the working class that we work out our problems. And I think there is a hint of somewhere within the movement of people beginning to feel they are frightened of the working class and what the democratic self-activity of the working class means. Political revolutions are always messy, but the safeguard is that we discuss things in an upfront manner, and we're being denied that democratic process within the movement at the moment. And I think that's where the real danger lies. Final part, because Emily asked about, we give more details of what the situation is within the leadership. Well, the leadership is a tiny, the movement's run by the tiniest group of people you can imagine. I remember when I was an MP, there's a morning get together on video between the leader at Westminster and Nicola and Peter and a couple of other people, and they decide the line. And there's I don't think you can run movements that way. I think that's very undemocratic. Even if people are not setting out to be democratic, that narrow an organizational framework leads people to lose the plot, to cease to be knowledgeable about what's going on. I genuinely think that only until the last recent moment with this kind of debate about list party, I think the leadership has been genuinely blind to what's going on in the movement. I think, to answer an earlier question, the reason why suddenly the John Swinney and the First Minister have been talking about the possibility of another list party, they suddenly made it an issue, is because they've suddenly woken up to what's going on. I think they have been very blind to what is going on inside the movement because they've cut themselves off from that. And I think it was spectacularly bad for Nicola not to have attended any huge all-under-one banner demonstrations. She was offered, and she was offered a veto over who would speak, because clearly they didn't want, there were certain people that Nicola didn't want to appear on a platform with. And she was offered a right of veto and she still would not take it. And it was only after a year, remember, that some of the key frontline ministers, like John Swinney, at last started going on the marches. So it has taken them a while. So the danger is, having cut themselves off from the membership, they've lost track of what the membership really thinks. And so they've suddenly woken up to this. And hopefully, if only in a minor way, my little piece has actually penetrated to the innermost ranks, and maybe people think a bit more. So I hope that answers Emily's question.
Thanks, George. I'm going to call on Tejas to come in, and then I've got some more written questions. Tejas?
Evening, George. So you're talking about, you know, the nature of the division emerging between the movement and the party leadership. But to some extent, I think, isn't this not just inevitable, but something to be encouraged and sharpened, these contradictions? Because just like in Catalonia, there will be a point where a truly autonomous independence movement, you know, autonomous from the party leadership, will come into positions of antagonism against the leadership itself. Essentially, what I'm saying is, if we agree on we have the same analysis of what's happening to the movement and its relationship to the party leadership, I think that it won't always be possible to have the leadership in locks. Instead of thinking of it as a leadership being in lockstep with the movement, we should strive for a situation where, like Catalonia, on the actual matter of independence, it's the movement that leads and the party leaders that follow.
Well, I'm revolving around your use of the word encourage. I mean, to look at the Catalan, Scotland examples, the Catalonia, the old Convergence Party was the dominant party. It was always the case that no one party had complete hegemony over the Catalan independence movement. The left Republicans have been the party of the Civil War and are still very strong. In fact, the Convergence tended to be the urban party. The Republicans tended to be the rural representative. So the movement was split between parties, but because nobody had a hegemony, it meant that you automatically had to create another forum to bring everyone together. Therefore, there was the ANC, the Catalan National Congress. So the parties didn't dominate, but it was easy for the Catalans in a sense, in inverted commas, easy because if no one party dominated, then you had to create a kind of civil society leadership for the movement. We are in a, you know, and we can't hide for it, we're in a very difficult position where the SNP is politically hegemonic. They are the Greens, but they're still relatively small. And I you know, another day we'll discuss the Greens. I long held criticism of the Greens is that they see themselves as a pressure group rather than a party of government. That's how you can never count on them being government. But you know, the SNP will be hegemonic, so that in itself creates tensions between the movement and the SNP government when the SNP is in government. Now, Alex Salmond, again, we're leaving certain things out of this discussion, but Salmond's political forte was that he was able to ride the two beasts at once. He could mobilise at a movement level to put pressure on Westminster, but he could also, you know, lay the movement aside and move, you know, when he did his, you know, when he was going through his phase of wanting tax cuts for a business and doing all his round of business. So Salmond could play both ends. So Salmond never forgot the movement. He played it sometimes, but he never forgot it. My worry is that the SNP leadership at the moment sees, it may not view this in crude terms. It may not quite understand what it's doing, but SNP leadership tends to see the mass movement as a bit of a nuisance, something that can be turned on and off. And it can't, because that's what we have to tell them. So I don't think that tension will go away, if that's what you're saying. So it's how to manage it. Now we've got an independent, we've got the Scottish Independence Convention, SIC. And that was set up as a way of bringing the movement together and bringing, Women for Independence and Commonweal and all the parts of the movement and the different political parties. The trouble with the Independence Convention is that it can only work by consensus. And because the SNP is the elephant in the room, the SNP leadership don't want to do anything, they don't, so SIC can't actually do anything. So SIC, in my view, Independence Convention, I think though it's still there, it does a bit of good work, it cannot operate as an umbrella body. We need to take the political parties out, or at least take out the dominance of the SNP. And that's for the Scottish government's own good, let me say. I suppose I'm behaving a bit, but I do think, I'm trying to avoid, I don't think we should pit the movement against the SNP, because my bones, I still think the SNP is a social democratic party and I'm still going to vote for it. But I think we have to negotiate and we have to try and persuade the persuadable inside the SNP that they can't go on operating this way. And that a division between the movement and the SNP is not good for either, let me say. And that's not what we want to happen.
Okay, I've got a question written here from Scott MacDonald. Scott says, George, you mentioned SNP staffers and their efforts to bring high finance and foreign direct investment. This brings us to the Growth Commission. Will working people be convinced by a programme which mandates naked capitalism with a tartan twist, unilaterally using British money beyond the bone austerity and whole-scale adoption of UK finance policy? Does the SNP slide rightwards into the hands of multinational capital damage the case for independence?
Does it damage the case? Well, let me put it this way. Let's suppose we had won the 2014 referendum, which you could have done without the last-minute intervention of the Daily Record and co. The proposal then was to keep the pound. Just like the Growth Commission has repeated them. If we had run smack into COVID-19, trying to keep the pound without a central bank, without our own currency, the Scottish economy would have collapsed because there has been no money to bail it out. We would have had to borrow from the City of London, and we wouldn't have got very much of that. We'd have had to borrow from the big international banks and literally sell the Scottish economy to the big banks. So the answer is yes. If you go down the road of the Growth Commission, then you end up in hock to the big banks. The British government has bailed itself out. It's just printed money. I mean, you hear a lot of talk about, there's a lot on the BBC today about how the second quarter showed the largest borrowings of the British government in near history. The British government hasn't borrowed a sou, hasn't borrowed a cent. Printed the damn money. Bank of England prints it, gives it to the government. So it's a swindle. If we had a central bank with our own currency, we'd have done the same. That's what got Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, all the small countries, they got out of economic chaos from the lockdown. We couldn't have done that unless we'd had a central bank and our own currency. So the position we took on currency in 2014 and the position reinforced by the Growth Commission, Andrew Wilson's Growth Commission, is bonkers. It's political illiteracy, economic illiteracy, and it puts you in the hands of foreign banks. Now, how have we got into that situation? Okay, in 2016, just after the Brexit referendum, the First Minister set up the Growth Commission, led by Andrew Wilson. Nobody was consulted, by the way. I still don't know how it was funded, because most of the money went to highly paid foreign consultants. So Growth Commission gets set up. And immediately it was announced, I phoned Andrew, he was an old friend of them. Not sure he's a friend now, according to him. And he flew down to London, and he and myself and Roger Mullen met in an expensive club, and we discussed how to write the growth report And the central axis of the growth report was finding a way of changing the 2014 line of keeping the pound and switching into having our own currency, creating our own central bank, and therefore running our own financial system. Discuss that, tasks were allocated. Then, of course, following the 2017 general election, emergency general election, and the defeat there, I still think it was a relative defeat, Nicola called off the India F2 campaign, and the Sustainable Growth Commission report suddenly went quiet, went into mothball. And I never heard any more from Andrew Wilson. What happened was that the consultants and Andrew talked to the banks, and the banks said, sorry, we don't want you to have your own currency. We certainly don't want you having your own regulatory regime. So the whole discussion, as of just after the 2016 Brexit referendum, was shelved. And lo and behold, when the growth report is published, there's been a 180-degree turn, and we're back to keeping the pound, directly because of the intervention and influence of the banks. Now, I admit there were some of the growth commissioners who actually want to move directly to the euro, and I suspect that's probably Andrew Wilson's position. And they were just kind of, we couldn't actually say that without frightening too many people, so they were leaving that until independence. I think people like Alan Smith and Andrew will push instantly for going directly to the euro, which means we'll have our currency and our finances run by Germany if we do that. So, you know, we are under, you know, the whole direction of the Growth Commission thinking is towards selling out to the big banks. And yes, there are discussions with the bankers, and there are discussions with the bank between SNP staffers and Growth Commission commissioners and the big banks, and that's what turned the tide on that one.
Okay, George, I've got a written question here from Paul. The question is, what role do you see the Radical Independence campaign taking within the grassroots independence movement? And actually, I might just add on to that a second question for myself. You mentioned the idea of the left taking on citizens' lists or so, for example, in the local elections. What kind of role do you see for organisations like the Radical Independence campaign and initiatives like that? And do you think pro-independence left, as a pro-independence left, should be getting involved in other things besides the independence campaign?
I mean, I think the left is in Scotland, in a broad sense, has clearly had a hammering over the last few years, and clearly fragmented. I think we have to distinguish between an anti-capitalist, a consciously anti-capitalist left, a kind of unconscious but moving leftwards working class movement, and you can see that around all under one banner. Rough and crude in its ideology, but moving towards anti-capitalist positions. We can see the old shards, Rick, SSP. There's a SNP socialist group within the SNP. So there's people around Conta. So the room is fragmented as part of the crisis and the friction between movement and leadership that I've been talking about. I don't think there's an easy organizational solution, right? I don't think, you know, it's just like, let's reanimate Rick, and it's been, I know in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dundee, it's been some reanimation. But COVID has clearly, the lockdown has clearly made things much more difficult. So I would urge, therefore, the maximum amount of joint activity, joint discussions between the different groups, rather than rush to find what's the perfect, you know, organizational solution. Now I know that Francis Curran has been talking to people. Contra's been reaching out to people. I know that we had the reanimation of some of the big city RIC groups before the lockdown. So I think there's a general feeling we need to start being discussed more. Maybe, you know, post the lockdown when things are a bit easier, we should have some kind of general assembly just to discuss things. But you know, we've got Zoom. We can do various things. I know, talking to folk around all under one banner, there's been discussion of trying to be more focused in how the movement organizes within trade unions. The SNP trade union group has about 11,000 nominal members, but its level of activity is rather circumscribed. What the SNP trade union group tends to do is represent trade union issues to the SNP as a party and as a conference and as a leadership. The SNP trade union group does not organize within the unions, doesn't have factions, even though it's got huge membership in the unions. So there may be a space for the left, because of its orientation to the trade unions, for the pro-independence left to begin to organize within the unions, and that's something we've never done. And I think there may be scope, because, you know, that goes beyond the factions, if you like, beyond the different bits of the unions. And it goes beyond independence and SSP and Greens. So I'm certainly interested over the next 6 months in looking at how, rather than sit in, you know, it's fun to sit and talk to ourselves. But I think we might look for some practical activity in trying to raise some campaign issues around independence within the union, especially as now we're, you know, at 54% and rising. You know, there's everything to play for, and I think reanimating campaigning and motions and material for specific unions might be a way for us all to cooperate and begin to build the unity that we've lost.
Thanks, George. I've got a written question here. Les Mackay asks, George, do you think there's any significance for us in the recent panel-based poll showing 49% in England for an independent England? They have been told for decades that Scotland is a burden. Could this be encouraged?
Yeah, I saw that. You know, be careful what you wish for. I mean, that reads to me like a very dangerous. I mean, I think, you know, I suspect in the absence of any proper debate, you know, somebody's been phoned up by the pollster and asking, you know, just read the questions and just say, yeah, that sounds fun, we'll do that. English nationalism in its present form is dangerous and right-wing, and encouraging it in that fashion, I think we should be very careful of. We want independence because we want friendship between the peoples of these the Atlantic archipelago. And we want, you know, they can't sell Scotland off and take it somewhere else. And above all, socialists, we want to encourage a socialist movement in England. So we want to reach out. But, you know, if the people of England genuinely do want to, you know, re-embrace their nationality and understand it, its positive and negative sides, you know, and you know, disavow the empire. I think we're going to see that, you know, in the statue events and so on, Black Lives Matter events. I mean, if there's a genuine current of Englishness and, you know, repossessing the Chartist movement, the anti-slavery movement, then that's good. But, you know, I remain to be convinced when, you know, when you ask people, do you want him to be independent? And I suspect there's a subtext, yes, let's keep the blacks in the place, let's keep the foreigners out. And that worries me.
Thanks, George. I'll maybe just expand on that question and ask, in the context of Wales and Ireland, obviously there are national movements there. And I saw that recently there were marches for independence in Wales, which I know a lot of people from the Scottish independence movement travelled down to attend. I'm curious whether you think there's any scope for increased cooperation with the Welsh and Irish national movements. And also, I know that there is, I'm not sure if I would call it a squeamishness on the part of some sections of Scottish nationalism to be associated with the Irish movement because of what they see as perhaps the toxicity of Sinn Féin. I'm curious what you think, if there is any possibility for even organisations like RIC to help bring the Scottish independence movement into other parts of these islands.
Yeah, I mean, the SNP all levels has always been reluctant to get involved with Ireland and Irish independence, Irish reunification. Indeed, I remember when the 79 group was created. Now, remember, the left was first organised within the SNP at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, under the 79 group banner. Sinn Féin invited 79 group to talk and to attend at Sardesh, and the person who quashed that decisively was Alex Salmon. Ireland, though, we live in changed times, and we have just seen the two main right-wing Irish parties, which between them lost the last general election, gang up against the wishes of the Republic's electorate to exclude Sinn Féin, the largest party now, election-wise in the Republic, exclude it from office. And that, that's going to create its own tensions politically at a democratic level. The latest polls that I've seen that are pre-COVID, and what they show is North and South support for reunifications now neck and neck with remaining within the UK. And I suspect that if you've taken polls since COVID, that might have shifted more in favour of reunification. But the two big parties who've grabbed, unconstitutionally, I think, the government in the South have recently, the last week or two, just come out, desperately saying no border poll, against the border poll, can't have this instability, etc., etc. But we're clearly moving towards Northern Ireland being in reunification with the South. And either Scotland becomes independent and that triggers the border poll, or the other way around. Either way you look at it, we're moving towards a major constitutional crisis of the UK. And I think it is time that the national movement here built more links with Ireland. North voted against Brexit. We've had the Good Friday Agreement for 20 years. Sinn Féin has eschewed the violent road for over 20 years. It's winning elections in the south and in the north. In the last northern election, it won a majority of the seats, a plurality of the seats. So Sinn Féin is the obvious party of self-government in the north, and we should be talking to it as a movement. Indeed, SNP should be talking to it as a party. Wales, of course, there's a much more complex social political mix in Wales, but Welsh independence is now at its highest polling rate ever. Sadly, I don't like it, but it looks like Wales might be left with England in a much reduced Great Britain. So I think the more work we do with Wales, the better. You can, if you're an SNP member, the one party you can also be a member of is Plaid Cymru. I'll give you that for nothing.
Thanks, George. Chris Gilgallen writes, within your article, I was quite alarmed at the fact that the SNP has been giving concessions to landlords and blocking chances of rent freezes in the midst of the pandemic. And he's got two questions. Firstly, is there much scope for RIC and other radical groups playing a larger part in these pandemic-specific problems? We don't know how long this period of unemployment and underemployment and other connected social consequences will continue. And he also asks, could you elaborate a bit further on these concessions to landlords and blocking of rent freezes?
On the rents, I mean, it was quite, as part of the lockdown economic recovery, the Scottish Government was giving financial support to big landlords. And when when Holyrood was discussing the COVID bill, various COVID bills, attempts were made, particularly by Andy Whiteman and the Greens, to get extension of no rent freeze to people in rented accommodation, particularly in social housing, and to provide financial subsidy to renters. And Scottish Government blocked that. And the position the government took, the SNP government took, was that if they supported a rent freeze, that would bankrupt particularly the housing associations. Well, you know, fund the housing associations. The other worry was that it could impact on the big building companies. A lot of the big building and investment companies are supported by Scottish Government to build rented housing. Rented housing isn't just, let me say, you know, some old age pensioner putting money away for the pension and buying 2 or 3 cheap houses and using the rent. I mean, much of the private rented accommodation is now supplied by big companies. Houses have been built new with money coming from big investment companies, foreign investment companies, but with a lot of state subsidy via the Scottish Government, which I find particularly outrageous, but there you go. I think that we could see a crisis post-lockdown and post the end of the furlough payments, when people who are in rented accommodation simply can't pay their rents if they're suddenly out of a job or are dependent on the ubiquitous and vile universal credit system. I suspect that if push comes to shove by the autumn, if we've got mass unemployment and people facing being thrown out of their property, the Scottish Government may be forced to do a U-turn. And certainly I think we should work on that. I think it should be a priority for the movement and the left to pressure the Scottish Government to change its mind and to provide for a rent freeze and for support for people with rent problems. That's perfectly feasible, and maybe it's another thing that the left should get together on. Bombard our MSPs, frighten the living death out of them. Demonstrations, I think that could well be, a focus for the movement, socialist movement as a whole come November, December.
That's great. Okay, I don't have any questions left at the moment. If anyone else has a final question for George, please let me know. But otherwise, I think we're wrapping up this part of the meeting. We still have some business to discuss afterwards, but maybe I could throw you one last question, George. There's a Scottish Parliament election next year. What are the chances we'll see you on the SNP benches?
I can safely say my chances of being on any SNP list from now on are 0. No, listen, you guys have to, there's a serious worry here. I worry about the left. I mean, I did a couple of years in Parliament, and I would tell you, being at Westminster is the most horrible thing you could spend your time doing. It is an obsequious, nasty, vile, rotten place. You're locked up with mad Tories. You're locked up with people who are who would do their damnedest to destroy the working class. Jeffrey Archer walks by you, and you want to spit on him. I mean, this is. Plus, you're made, you're sucked in, right? You're cold, sir. They open doors for you. I mean, you're made to feel part of something, some elite, right? The last thing on earth I would ever want to do is go back to Westminster. It is a horrible place. I think the SNP and any socialist party worth its salt should have term limits. You should never allow anybody to do more than 1 term. Otherwise, they get sucked into the system. So when people ask me, do I want to go back to Parliament? You shouldn't be asking that question, guys and girls. That's the wrong question to ask. Term limits.
Well, thanks very much, George. That's a pretty decisive answer. Okay, so I'm going to bring to close this this part of the discussion. There's a couple of different things on the agenda. George, you're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting.
I'm gonna go off because I need to feed my cat because the cats are eating my feet. It's been lovely to talk. Thank you so much. Maybe another time.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Thanks, George.